Wyoming Territory, 1877, the wind howled low through the cottonwoods as snow melted into mud, and Pearl Ellison knelt beside the half-conscious Cheyenne scout bleeding in her barn. He should have died out there. The dogs had barked wild just past dawn, and she had gone out with her rifle expecting coyotes or another lost trapper. Instead, she found him half buried in snow, arrow in his side, face bruised, one eye swollen shut. She had stared at him for a long moment, snow falling quiet around them, rifle tight in her grip. He was clearly Cheyenne, clearly dying, and she dragged him in anyway. Now, inside the barn, he groaned low as she poured warm water over the wound. He flinched, but his hands stayed limp at his sides. "I do not know who did this to you," she murmured, pressing clean cloth against his skin, "but I am not letting you die here." His eyes fluttered open, dark and sharp with pain. She saw the moment he understood he was in a white woman's barn, alive. She braced herself for panic or anger. Instead, he whispered, "You are alone," she blinked. Yes, he looked at her hands, steady and pale against him. Why? Pearl hesitated. "My husband was shot last spring. He was foolish and fast with words. He picked the wrong fight in Cheyenne. He died in the street." Her voice caught. "I buried him alone and kept the land. No one else to do it." The scout nodded like he understood something deep. Then he passed out again. He stayed feverish for 3 days. Pearl kept him alive with boiled willow bark and soup from her dwindling stores. On the 4th morning, he woke fully. Sat up, saw her again as if for the first time. "My name is Zeke Elkwalker," he said, voice hoarse but clear. She paused, holding the tin cup of water. "Pearl Ellison." He looked around the barn. "You should not have brought me here. They will come looking." "I figured that," she said, handing him the cup. "But I do not leave people in the snow." Zeke drank, slow and careful. "You are strange." Pearl smiled faintly. "You are welcome." He healed slow. His ribs were bruised, his shoulder sliced clean through, and the arrow wound near his hip festered before it improved. She kept him in the barn, fed him, changed his bandages, and said little. She had always been quiet with people, but quiet did not mean cold. She saw the way he watched, never afraid, never ungrateful, just curious. He asked few questions, but when he did, they mattered. By the 2nd week, he was on his feet, limping but stronger. One evening, she found him outside the barn, staring at the tree line. His hair was loose, thick as crow feathers, and the setting sun cut across his worn face. "Are you leaving?" she asked. Zeke glanced back at her. "Would you want me to?" Pearl folded her arms. "You are not my prisoner." He stepped closer. "You saved me, risked your name, your land." "Why?" She looked up at him, heart thudding. "Because you were dying," Zeke nodded, "and now I am not." Pearl could not answer that. She just turned, walked back to the house. She felt his eyes on her the whole way. That night she lit a 2nd lamp. By the 3rd week he slept inside. They never spoke of it. He followed her in one cold evening, limping less, and she pointed to the cot by the stove. He did not ask questions. She gave him stew, and he ate slow and careful, never wasting a bite. He started helping, splitting wood, feeding the hens, fixing the broken hinge on the barn door. Pearl watched him from the porch, arms crossed, heart full of a strange heat she had not felt in years. One morning she caught him watching her the same way. "You work like a man," he said. "I have to," Zeke nodded. "You are strong." "So are you," he smiled, just barely. It lit something in his eyes. Spring came early that year. The mud dried fast and the hills turned green with wild shoots. Pearl rode into town one morning for salt and flour, and when she returned, the garden was turned and ready. Zeke stood beside it, hands dirty, chest bare under the sun. She stopped in the yard and stared. "You did all this?" she asked. He wiped sweat from his brow. "You feed me." "I feed you," Pearl swallowed hard. "That is not how it works. It is how I want it to." One night, a storm rolled in. Rain pounded the roof and thunder shook the windows. Pearl sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Zeke sat across from her, sharpening a blade. She spoke without looking up. "I do not know what to call this." He looked at her, eyes soft. "Call it peace." She met his gaze. "I have not had peace in a long time." He stood, crossed the space between them, and knelt beside her chair. His hand was rough, warm as he touched hers. "You saved me," he said. "You did not have to, but you did." Pearl's voice broke. "I could not let you die." Zeke leaned his forehead against hers. "Then let me stay." She closed her eyes, breath trembling. "Please." They kissed, quiet and slow, like the first warmth of spring after a long winter. From then on, he was hers. He built a fence around the pasture. She baked bread more often. They planted beans and carrots. Zeke carved her a wooden comb. Pearl sewed him a shirt from old fabric she had tucked away, and it fit him like it belonged. They laughed one morning when the rooster chased him across the yard. She laughed again when he lifted her into the river shallows and she splashed him back. His hands never wandered where they should not, but his eyes held her like he already knew every part of her, and she let him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, Zeke took her hand beside the garden bed. He looked into her eyes, steady and sure. "I want to build more here," he said, Pearl's heart caught. "With me," he nodded. "Only with you," she smiled, tears burning. "I never expected this." Zeke kissed her forehead. "Neither did I." But they both believed it now. And that was enough. The earth warmed slow that year, and by late April the creek behind the house had thinned to a steady whisper. Zeke stood ankle-deep in it, trousers rolled, pulling stones to line the banks. Pearl knelt farther up, planting onions between rows of carrots. The breeze carried the distant cry of a hawk, and the sky stretched clean and blue above them. "You always this quiet when you work?" she asked, brushing dirt from her fingers. Zeke looked up. "Talking makes the hands slower." She smiled, not answering, and tucked another seedling into place. The soil was dark and loose, good for growing if you knew how to coax it. Her father had taught her once, before the war took him. She hadn't thought of that lesson in years. Zeke climbed from the creek, wiping his hands on his thighs. "I think the deer come down here." Pearl shaded her eyes. "You see tracks," he nodded toward the trees. "Two sets, one smaller." "Maybe a fawn." "I could set a snare tomorrow." He tilted his head. "Rather you didn't," she paused. "Why? The meat's thin this time of year, and it's a mother. I'd rather wait." Pearl studied him, surprised. "You think like that often?" "I was taught to," he said, brushing a twig from his shoulder. "The land gives more when you're patient." She nodded, not because she had always known that, but because it felt right coming from him. That afternoon, he took the axe to the old cottonwood out back. The trunk leaned sharp over the shed, warped from storms. He worked shirtless again, and Pearl didn't look away as the muscles in his back pulled and shifted with each swing. The tree fell near dusk, and he split the trunk into neat rounds without a word. When they came inside, she made coffee from the last of the beans and slid the cup toward him where he sat by the stove. "Do you miss your people?" she asked, not lifting her gaze. Zeke held the cup between his hands. "I miss the way they spoke to one another." "The way nothing had to be explained," she nodded slowly. "I talk too little, I've been told." "You talk right," he said. "You listen." They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't empty. The wind tapped at the windows. A kettle hissed softly. He reached across the table and brushed his thumb across her knuckles. She didn't pull away. The next morning, he carved a new handle for the garden spade. The old one had cracked near the base, and she'd tied it up with twine for weeks. When he handed her the new one, smooth, sanded, perfectly fit, she didn't speak, just held it between her hands and ran her thumb along the grain. Later, she found him up in the loft with a canvas sack, sorting through what few belongings he had left. A worn pouch of tobacco, a bone-handled knife, a scrap of deerskin stitched with red thread. "You leaving?" she asked, voice even. "No," he said. "Just didn't want to forget what I carried in." She stepped forward, slow. "I don't want you to forget, but I don't want you to feel like you have to keep standing at the edge, neither." He turned to face her fully. "I've never stayed anywhere without a reason." "And now?" she asked, heart beating hard. Zeke reached out and touched a strand of her hair where it had fallen loose from her braid. "Now I've got one." That night, she pulled the quilt down from the high shelf in the bedroom. It was the one her mother had pieced together when she was a girl, all faded flannels and crooked seams. She laid it across the bed before they turned in. Zeke stood in the doorway a long time before stepping inside. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't press. He just sat beside her and took her hand, and she leaned against his shoulder, letting the quiet fill the room. The next few weeks passed in steady rhythm. Zeke dug a trench to guide the runoff from the spring rains away from the barn. Pearl traded eggs for sugar with the widow who lived 2 miles east. They didn't speak of what came next, but it lived between them in the way their hands brushed at the table, in the way he watched her fix the hinge on the back door, in the way she set out 2 cups each morning without thinking. One evening, as they walked the fence line, Zeke stopped beside the post where the wire sagged. "You ever think about building something bigger?" he asked. Pearl frowned. "You mean more land?" "No," he said, turning toward her. "I mean a family." She stared at him, throat tight. "I thought about it once." He waited, patient. "It never felt real," she said finally. "Not after everything." Zeke stepped closer, voice low. "It could be." Pearl looked at him, the wind lifting the edge of her shawl. "You'd stay for that." "I'd stay for you," he said. "And whatever comes with you." She pressed a hand to his chest, felt the steady beat beneath her palm. "Then let's build it. All of it." He kissed her then, not gentle, not fierce, just certain, and this time she kissed him back with all the pieces of herself she hadn't known were still whole. Late May brought a stretch of heat that settled into the grass and timber like it meant to stay. The creek slowed to a hush, its banks thick with wild mint, and the cottonwoods dropped their catkins in drifting white clouds that clung to the edges of the porch. Zeke crouched near the base of the corral, fitting a new crossbeam with the last of the cedar he'd planed. His shirt clung damp to his back, and his brow was streaked with dust. Pearl brought him a tin cup of water and stood beside him while he drank, the brim of her hat shading her face. "You always this stubborn about finishing things before sundown?" she asked. He rested the cup on the fence post. "If I don't do it today, it'll pull loose in the first storm." Pearl tilted her head. "You think that far ahead?" "I was taught to watch the sky before it turned," he said, pressing the beam into place. "My uncle used to say, if you wait to worry, you'll always be late." She crouched beside him, brushing sawdust from the top rail. "Sounds like he knew what he was talking about." "He did," Zeke said. "He raised me after my mother passed, never spoke much, but when he did, you listened." Pearl worked her jaw, quiet a moment. "Did he live to see you grown?" "No, died when I was 16. Fever took him in 4 days. She didn't speak again for a while, just helped hold the boards straight while he drove the nails. When they stood at last to stretch their backs, the sun had dipped low enough to throw long shadows across the pasture. Inside, she poured cornmeal into a bowl beside the hearth, and Zeke sat near the window, sharpening the small skinning knife he used to clean rabbits. The fire crackled steady. She didn't turn when she asked, "Do you ever wish you'd had children yet?" Zeke ran the blade slow along the stone. "Sometimes, but I never stayed anywhere long enough." Pearl added water to the dough, mixing it with her fingers. "I think I would have been afraid to raise a child in all this. War, drought, men with no patience." He set the knife down. "Maybe. But you're not afraid now." "No," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Not anymore." Zeke stood, crossed to her, and wiped his hands on his trousers. "You want that still? A family?" She nodded once. "If it's with you, yes." He took her hand then, not as a question, but as a promise. By the next week, he'd cleared the patch behind the shed and began laying stones for a smokehouse. Pearl watched from the stoop, her needle paused mid-stitch. When he saw her looking, he lifted one hand in greeting and returned to work, the sun catching the curve of his jaw. That evening, she found him in the doorway of the barn, staring out toward the distant ridgeline. "You see something?" she asked, stepping beside him. "No," he said, "just thinking about." He glanced down at her. "If your neighbors would raise a fuss knowing you took a Cheyenne man into your home," Pearl crossed her arms. "They'd already whisper if they wanted to. Besides, I'm not hiding you." His mouth tugged into something close to a smile. "You ever care what they say?" "I used to," she said. "When I was younger, when I thought I had to earn a place. And now," she met his eyes. "Now I've got a place I made myself." Zeke nodded slowly. I'd protect that, whatever it took. I know, she said. That's why I trust you. Later that night, they sat by the fire and talked about what they'd build next. She wanted a second room added off the back, something with windows that caught the morning light. He said he'd start drawing it out once the smokehouse was done. She leaned her shoulder into his, and he rested his hand over hers, their fingers knotting together without effort. June came with light rain and the first shoots of squash curling up from the soil. Zeke repaired the old wagon axle, and Pearl stitched new curtains from bolts of muslin she'd bartered for 5 years back and never used. One morning, as she swept the porch, he stepped inside from the yard with something wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her without a word, and she unwrapped it slow, a carved wooden cradle, small and smooth with her initials etched into the base. She looked up, throat thick. You made this, he nodded. I thought we should be ready. Pearl touched the edge, the curve of the rockers. It's beautiful. Zeke took her hand, calloused fingers warm around hers. I want to marry you. She stared at him, heart thudding. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything, he said. Not because you saved me, not because I owe you, but because I want to wake beside you every morning until we're old. Pearl's hand trembled where it held his. Then yes, I want that too. They married beneath the cottonwoods 3 days later under a sky full of birdsong and breeze. No preacher, no guests, just the two of them and the land that had carried them through. And in that quiet, steady place, they began the rest of their life together. The first foal was born in the early light of July, just as the heat broke from a week of dry wind. Pearl had risen before dawn to pump water when she heard the mare's restless shifting in the stall. By the time Zeke reached her side, the colt was already halfway into the world, slick with birth and trembling. He's strong, Zeke said, crouching beside her, his palm firm on the mare's flank. Pearl wiped her hands on her apron, breath unsteady. We'll need to fence the far side of the pasture. He'll run. Zeke looked up at her. You want to keep him, she nodded. He's ours now. They didn't name the colt, not then. He was just another part of the land, same as the wild plums ripening along the creek, or the rustle of corn leaves in the afternoon wind. By midsummer, the smokehouse walls stood tall and square, roofed with hand-hewn cedar boards. Pearl hung the first slabs of venison Zeke had brought back from the hills, their edges salted and dark. You ever build one before? She asked, watching the way he checked the vent at the top. No, he said, but I watched my uncle build one when I was a boy. Remembered more than I thought. Pearl leaned against the doorframe. You remember things quiet, Zeke, like you're always watching in case no one else does. I had to, he said simply. There wasn't anyone else to pass it down. She didn't answer that, but she didn't need to. She walked to him, set her hand on his chest. You'll pass it down here. He looked at her then, long and deliberate. You think the world'll let us keep this peace? Pearl didn't look away. I think we'll make it. In late August, a letter arrived, tucked in the pocket of a peddler who came through trading needles and molasses. Pearl read it at the table while Zeke ran a whetstone down the blade of the scythe. She set the paper down. My younger brother's coming. He's been working cattle in the Dakota Territory. Said he heard I took up with a Cheyenne and wanted to see for himself. Zeke didn't pause. How long since you saw him? 7 years, she said. Not since before the war. He stopped then. You want him here? I don't know, Pearl admitted. He was always half wild, but he's blood. Zeke nodded once. I'll make a place for him to sleep. Pearl reached across the table, her fingers resting over his. He'll have to see for himself what we are. I won't explain it. You don't need to, Zeke said. Let him look. When her brother arrived, it was with a lean gelding and a fresh scar along his jaw. He wore his hat low and his words plain, not offering judgment but not hiding it either. He watched Zeke closely, said little the first night, and took his coffee without sugar. You always did go your own way, he said to Pearl on the porch after supper. She folded her arms. I went the way that saved me. He looked toward the barn where Zeke was oiling the hinges. He treat you right. He treats me like I'm worth something, she said. That's more than most men ever tried. Her brother gave a low grunt. That's fair. By the third day, he helped Zeke haul water from the spring, and by the fourth, he was asking about the way they laid the fence line. "He's not what I expected," he told Pearl that evening as the sun dropped behind the ridge. "You expected a savage," she said flatly. "I expected someone who'd look at me with hate," he said. "But he doesn't. He doesn't waste time like that," she said. He gave a slow nod. "Then I'll come back in the fall, help finish the north fence." Pearl didn't say thank you. She just handed him a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth when he saddled up the next morning, and he touched Zeke's shoulder before riding off. By September, the nights cooled. Zeke stacked firewood in careful cords, and Pearl laid garlic between the rows of beans to draw pests from the roots. One morning, she woke before light and sat quietly beside the hearth, hands resting on her stomach. When Zeke came in from the porch, she didn't look up. "I think I'm carrying," he crossed to her, crouched beside the chair. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've been late before, but not like this." Zeke pressed his hand gently over hers. "You afraid?" Pearl turned to him. "No, it feels right." He didn't speak for a long moment. "Then, I want to raise our children in a place where they don't have to choose between blood and truth." "They won't," she said. "Not if we show them both." That night they sat on the bed with the quilt folded low, bodies quiet and close. She traced the lines of his collarbone, and he rested his hand over the curve of her hip, where new life had begun to root. Outside, the wind moved steady through the grass, and the land pressed in around them, solid and wide. They had built something no one had given them, and they would keep it. Together, a frost came early that year, crisping the tops of the bean stalks and turning the edges of the cottonwood leaves pale gold. Zeke laid extra straw in the chicken coop and strung oilcloth over the window gaps in the barn while Pearl stitched heavier curtains for the bedroom, the child inside her growing more certain by the week. One morning, while the kettle warmed on the stove, she stood at the table with her hand resting on the small rise beneath her apron. Zeke came in from the yard, boots muddy, and paused when he saw her still like that. "You felt something?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, not turning. "Just once." Like a twitch from inside. He stepped behind her, his hand covering hers, the heat of it steady. "We should clear the birthing room before snow comes." She leaned back against him. "I'll need a midwife, someone who knows what to do when things go wrong." Zeke pressed his cheek to her temple. "I'll ride to Rawlins next week. There's a woman there named Esther Tallon. She delivered my cousin's daughter years back. She'll come if I ask." Pearl let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You still remember names from that far back." "I remember what matters," he said. That same day, they moved the spare cot from the back room and cleaned out the chest of linens. Pearl found a small bonnet her mother had sewn from muslin when she was still a girl. She ran her fingers along the stitching, then folded it carefully into the cradle. The next morning, Zeke rode out. He was gone 4 days. Pearl kept herself busy preserving apples, boiling jars, scrubbing the shutters. But each night she lay awake, listening to the wind scrape the eaves, her hand flat over her belly. When he returned, covered in trail dust with a satchel of herbs and a note from the midwife, she nearly wept. "You didn't have to hurry," she said, trying to sound steady. Zeke dismounted, tying the horse with practiced hands. "I wasn't going to sleep in that town." "Not when you needed me here." Pearl watched him unload the saddlebag. "She'll come," he nodded. 2 weeks before the due month. She's got kin near Saratoga, said she'd stay in the area. That night they sat on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the stars blink through the thin clouds. Pearl leaned into his side, her hair loose down her back. "You ever think about names?" she asked. Zeke ran his thumb along the back of her hand. "For a son or a daughter, both." He was quiet a moment, then said, "My mother's name was Aluna." Pearl repeated it under her breath, then smiled. "It's beautiful." He looked at her, eyes soft. "You've never asked about her. I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." "I was 10 when she passed," he said. "But I remember her voice. Low, like river water in spring, she used to sing while she worked." "Not words, just sound." Pearl rested her head on his shoulder. "Then if it's a girl, we'll name her Aluna. And if it's a boy," she glanced up at him, "you choose." He folded her hand in his. "I'd name him for strength, not the kind that makes noise. The kind that holds steady when everything else breaks." Pearl nodded, satisfied. "Then he'll have your name." Winter settled in quiet and slow. Snow came in layers, dry and powdery, then heavy and wet. Zeke cleared the roof each morning and Pearl cut strips for the quilt she'd begun. They spoke less, but the quiet held warmth. When she was too tired to cook, he made meals without asking. When his hands cracked from the cold, she rubbed tallow into them at night. As her time drew near, the midwife arrived with a creaky wagon and a firm voice. She brought jars of dried raspberry leaf and a folded birthing stool wrapped in burlap. She nodded once at Zeke, then took Pearl's elbow and led her inside. "She's strong," the midwife said that evening, "and this child's sitting right. You keep her rested and things'll go smooth." Zeke stood at the door, arms crossed. "I'll see to it." The birth came early on the first day of March, while wind rattled the shutters and snow fell thick across the yard. Pearl labored long, her hands clenched in linen, breath ragged. Zeke never left the room, holding her through each wave. She didn't cry out, but her eyes shone with pain and grit. Just before dawn, a cry split the air, sharp, insistent, new. "It's a girl," the midwife said, her hands quick and sure. "Strong lungs." Zeke sat beside Pearl, his brow damp, eyes wide. The child was placed in her arms, wrapped in her mother's old shawl. She was dark-haired and pink-faced, fists clenched. Pearl looked down at her, tears slipping silent. "Aluna," she whispered. Zeke touched the baby's brow. "She's perfect." They buried the afterbirth beneath the cottonwood where the breeze always moved. The midwife stayed 3 nights, then left with jars of preserves and a small sack of flour. In the weeks that followed, time narrowed. Zeke rose early to tend the animals while Pearl nursed Aluna by the stove, humming soft. They moved through each day without rush, without need for words. She grew stronger. He built a cradle rocker from pine and strung a feather mobile above it. One morning, as thaw dripped from the eaves, Pearl stood in the doorway holding their daughter. Zeke looked up from the garden bed he was turning and smiled, slow and full, like sun over snow. "You ready to teach her?" he called. Pearl stepped onto the porch. "Not yet." "But soon." That evening they walked the pasture at twilight, Aluna asleep against Pearl's chest. Zeke took her free hand and kissed the back of it, their steps falling into rhythm as the sky swelled with stars. They had built their life piece by piece, from silence and sorrow, from risk and resolve. And now, with the land greening again beneath their feet and a child warm between them, they had everything they'd waited for. They never left the homestead. Each season came and passed, marked by new fences, deeper roots, and the steady rise of laughter in the yard. When Aluna took her first steps, it was between Zeke's outstretched arms and Pearl's open hands. Years later, neighbors came from as far as Rawlins to trade seeds and stories, and no one questioned the strength of the family that had grown out of winter and grief. The land knew them. The wind carried their warmth. And every morning, Pearl woke with Zeke's hand in hers and their daughter's breath soft in the next room. The world went on. But in that house by the creek, love held fast. Forever.